Let's see, I think I could probably do that.
I'm unmuted.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, great. So Marilyn has an important part to play here this morning.
Right, right. Well, and thanks to LD, I think I know which buttons to push when we get into this. Okay, I'm really excited about being able to introduce Dr. Feldman. She is just a woman of many talents. She grew up in Chicago and learned how to play the blues. And I tell you, she can play one wicked fiddle, but she also can play the organ and the piano, and she can sing. So, more talents than a normal person, I guess. After med school at the University of Michigan, she had a
Can't see the
residency.
video.
Pardon me.
We can't see the video. You also took.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Oh.
Marilyn's doing an introduction right now.
Okay, should I continue?
Yes, please do.
Okay. After med school at the University of Michigan, she had a residency at OHSU as chief of pediatrics, and then she worked for Kaiser, specializing in prevention and treatment of child abuse. She has gone on 20 international volunteer work trips. And last year she came and she told us about one of them that she had been on. She's been to India, Ecuador, Guatemala, and New Orleans after Katrina. After she retired from Kaiser, she worked on immigration justice advocacy with ACLU and the new sanctuary movement. And we need to hear more about that, I guess. She also volunteers at Multnomah Library when it's open as outreach coordinator for Association of Chamber Music Players. She plays the organ at her church, and she is a jug band director. I hope she'll define that for us. Okay, and I don't think there's enough hours in the day for this woman. So anyway, looking forward to your speech, Jenny.
Thanks, Marilyn. I think I want to line you up now for my funeral oration.
Okay, just give me a buzz, I'll do it.
All right. So welcome and congratulations for your bravery, not only in coming to one of SSI's first Zoom presentations, but also during COVID and wildfires. Bravo. Maybe this will take your minds off all of that for a few hours. My talk today is based on my medical work at the border in Tijuana. But I was a lit major studying the world's great comedies, which this won't be one of, and its tragedies, which it will. And I do want to give you your money's worth, so I'm going to sprinkle a little literature, some art, some religion. Actually, one of the more hopeful aspects of our work at the southern border was how ecumenical it was, both within my family, my husband's Jewish, and within the religious communities who were working together there. And they overcame the common antipathy of one church towards another, avoiding religion's tendency to exclude the other and side with the oppressor. Okay, here's some literature. Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick quoted the Hebrew prophet Jeremiah and used the metaphor of a whaling ship, the Rachel, whose captain had just lost his two sons. Quote, "A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and bitter weeping, Rachel crying for her children, finding no consolation because they were no more." Ramah was another border town where Rachel's children were captive, maybe dead, under the rule of an evil king. So we'll move ahead to the New Testament, which echoes Jeremiah. King Herod cruelly abused his office, slaughtering all Bethlehem's babies to keep power. Quote, "Herod, seeing he'd been tricked by the wise men, was furious and killed all of the children, fulfilling Jeremiah. A voice is heard in Ramah, Rachel weeping for her children." By the way, it was to escape this genocide that Jesus' family was said to have immigrated to Egypt. Now, perhaps you'll be as surprised as I was to find a lot of Muslims helping in Tijuana. And they taught me that their prophet Muhammad is known for setting up his capital city, Medina, as a multicultural city where all immigrants of all faiths lived in peace. Does that surprise your concept of Islam? From their Holy Quran, Surah An-Nur, number 22, let those among you, imbued with Allah's grace, help those in want, those who have left their homes. So the scriptures of these three Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, are stories of immigrants. God, Allah, commands their followers to care for immigrants. The Old Testament has 53 such commands. Christianity's New Testament echoes the Old. Welcome the stranger, as he may be an angel in your midst. Locally, our Buddhist and our Sikh communities, based on their faith traditions, have been in the forefront of immigrant justice. Okay, so here's where I have to. So first, some definitions. Immigrants, refugees, same thing? No. Rachel's lament for incarcerated Jews was 2,500 years before the UN High Commission on Refugees in post-World War II's refugee mess set up international rules on how refugee status was granted to persons fleeing violence or persecution. A refugee designation by UN and US law entitles a person to services including funds. And such funds allowed our local nonprofits, ERCO, Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon's Catholic Charities, Lutheran Community Services, to successfully settle 60,000 such designated refugees. So refugees post-World War II, all that mess, was 11 million. Any guesses how many refugees and displaced persons in today's world? Guesses? $80 million. And that's at least 80 million. And half of those are children. Interesting to me as a pediatrician. Now here's the first time for your sigh break to fight Zoom fatigue. Studies have shown that people during texting and Zooming breathe differently. They hold their breaths more. They don't sigh as usual. So we're going to take some regular sigh breaks. A deep, slow breath in and out. I hope you're all doing that. I can't monitor, but I hope you're doing it. Anyways, in December, my husband and I served at the wall in Tijuana in stocks with Refugee Health Alliance, but we didn't actually care for refugees by the UN's definition, but for asylees. Asylees are those seeking designation as refugees. We also cared for deportees, people arrested and sent to Mexico by our government. So I wanted to ask here, I'm going to stop sharing, if any of you have had experiences with detention of your neighbor, immigrants, community members, friends. Raise your hands if you have. I'm going to look at you all. Okay, I see some hands raised. Okay, let me see, go over here. Keep your hands up. All right, not a lot of you. Okay. Well, you may have also heard of such arrests of community members on the news. Well, non-Fox News anyway. So some of you may be not aware of the tragic results of such arrests in the US. Families broken up, kids rendered destitute as their breadwinners deported, and then a vacuum. What happens after the deportee is swallowed up into wherever? We have a little... In Tijuana, we worked 1 block south of this wall. We saw how those tragedies marched on to the other side of this ugly barbed wire we were looking at for so long. Looking north to the U.S. through this wire, you'd see the International Friendship Park, ironically empty of people, no less friends, only Border Patrol trucks. And all the way to the clinic each day, we were in the shadow of Tijuana's second wall. You see that first one now, second one. 15-mile long, 18-foot high, $147 million beauty. I'm going to recount the wall's people stories, but let's not forget its environmental impact. First, the wall's construction is exempt from over 30 environmental laws. Its eminent domain overrides everything. Second, its 2,000 miles bisects ranges of 1,500 native animals and plants, fatally dividing monarch and many other butterfly sanctuaries, disrupting wildlife refuges and our most pristine national parks. The wall crashes through the breeding grounds for over 60 endangered species, like the ocelot, which is found nowhere else in the world. Only birds who are not scared away by the wall's 24 hours a day floodlights can fly over the wall, or art can. As a pediatrician, this is my favorite wall art. Third, the wall acts as a dam. Flash floods are disasters, and they increased right after George Bush's first 700 miles. Later, I'll show you Tijuana's flooding. Now, on the bright side, you'll be so happy to know that your tax dollars have worked. Marijuana smuggling is down. Of course, not due to the fact that marijuana is now legal in 33 states. Too bad, though, crystal meth smuggling is up from 80 pounds pre-wall to 3,000 pounds post-wall. And the $29 billion in drug profits each year still flows across that wall. The $147 million price tag included stuff repatriated a la Robin Hood by angry, poor Mexicans. Yep, highly successful wall. Well, as a public health doc, I need to know some numbers, and I've already given you lots, and I will give you lots today. But numbers are pretty numbing, aren't they? So let's walk with some of the individuals we were honored to serve. Now, even my Jewish husband, George, frequently met Jesus there and angels, only partly because Jesus, and Angel, angel, were the most common names there. But our first patient, Jesus and his wife, Ana, had just fled El Salvador the week prior. Their son had been macheted to death by gangs directed by the military. They were told, "You're next." What possible words of consolation? It was pre-COVID, so we gave them hugs. Jesus was coughing wildly and soaking wet, living on the streets in the rain. The most we could do, refer him, just a minute, I think my husband's talking a lot. George. I'm sorry, I should have invited him. Anyways, Jesus, he was coughing wildly, and so we referred him to a small new shelter built by these angels. These are the Shelter Promise people who are part of the national organization Border Angels. But we sadly knew that Jesus, even with our cough medicine, would likely add to the oh-so-common sleep deprivation. Not everything's working here. Let's see. LD, can you help? I'm not seeming to get my slideshow presenting there. There we go. All right. So this is a typical shelter that Jesus might have gone to. Now his wife Ana was in constant tears. Jesus' grief was buried in his fear of being sent back to El Salvador, or being tracked by gangs, or being kidnapped. And his fears were real. We saw all three happening. Our immigration policies have turned border towns into gangland. 4 of our president's recent orders assure that border towns are filled with people who migrate and who haven't heard or attended Senior Studies Institute to find out all about these new rulings. The U.S. still has a reputation of harboring those fleeing persecution. They know that it's a little harder to get into, but not everything that's going on. So Jesus and his family just knew they just had to get out, like the prescient Jews before World War II. The first policy, stuffing our border towns, the absurdly titled Migrant Protection Policy, contravenes our own U.S. law as well as international law, the Geneva Conventions. It now requires asylum seekers to await their cases outside the U.S. Not legal. Number 2, asylees are ineligible for credible fear interviews, which would get them refugee status, unless they've applied and been refused asylum in another country, again against UN law. Metering limits the number of migrants allowed to start the asylum process at the border. On some days in Tijuana, none get in, versus averages of 150 prior to a certain president. And number 4, the few who do get in face drastically shrunk credible fear criteria. Only 0.1% of fleeing asylees now pass. Weep with my patient Rosa, whom I had to tell, your years of severe domestic violence, it's just been eliminated as an accepted reason for asylum. Same with gender violence. No persecuted LGBTs will cross our borders. So consequently, over 32,000 asylees per year stew in just this border town, Tijuana alone, ripe for gang actions. Now, studies in other border towns have shown that almost 3/4 of waiting migrants have been assaulted, half have been kidnapped, half. Paying ransom is now an additional cost in immigrants' journeys. These sky-high levels of violence got Doctors Without Borders to start work in a Texas border town, the violence comparable to foreign war zones where they usually work. Time for a sigh break, at least for me. So we worked a few blocks from this Tijuana wall, where you can see painted on the wall the names of the lost, dead or in jails or cages somewhere, deported vets, an anguished letter begging our president for news of their loved ones. The wall even tries to defy oceans. Now, high above, you can barely see a little dot, which is the constant U.S. helicopter. You can't see the ever-present drones, so they see you. I'm sure we're on Customs Border Patrol's dartboard somewhere. By the way, if you're kind of lost in some of my designations, the old INS, Immigration Naturalization Service, was eliminated in 2003 with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. 2 new agencies took precedent: ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and CBP, Customs and Border Protection. You may have heard of those recently because both of whose agents you saw at Justice Center protests last month, administering mace, tear gas, supposedly non-lethal bullets, and flash bombs. So naturalization is no longer service, but enforcement. Now, while our wall stories are mostly of despair, there is hope to share. We don't have to be Rachel's weeping without consolation. We saw hope, even joy, in the wall art. Another hopefully inspiring story was the birth of Refugee Health Alliance, RHA. Student Phil was doing migrant research in Tijuana, and he sat many nights bemoaning to his bartender the awful health of asylees. The bar owner commiserated, as all good bartenders do, but also wisely asked Phil, well, What will you do? Young Phil dreamed, if I only had a space, I bet I could get docs and nurses to come down. The bar owner mused, well, Saturday mornings are pretty slow here. A year later, young Phil and some of his faculty had raised enough money to have Refugee Health Alliance start here in the bar. Soon, enough volunteers, docs came down to expand to weekend health camps the whole weekend, going to migrant shelters. And then a daily clinic was added with a new partner, Preven Casa, whose clinic in a slum for deportees, homeless vets, HIV positive and transgender folks, the asylees no one else cared for. I love this story, going from bar to full clinic. A typical camp, and imagine how rapidly now COVID would go through this camp. Most camps and shelters are very far from clinics, so our RHA sends teams out. We should go out every Saturday, 40 or 50 volunteers, mostly from San Diego, to care for those living inside churches, warehouses, outside schools, any place those 32,000 asylees and deportees can find spots to sleep or pitch tents. Our care was pretty narrow, few labs, bare x-rays, limited drugs, no specialist, no ophthalmologist for my teen with a severe eye infection after a piece of iron flew into it. She lost most of her vision. Now, hundreds of migrant shanty towns spring up in Tijuana's least desirable areas, the hills. No electricity, no sewers. With floods worsened by the wall traversing those hills, the gullies and the hills are rapidly converted into sewers. This was our team walking up to a shelter, and this was our team sliding down the shelter after the rain started. Now an open sewer. I really wish I had some smell-o-vision so you could get the full flavor here. But precarious shelters washed down, creating these debris-filled gullies. Now my photos can portray camps, what they're like physically. This is one in one of the nicest shelters, but still wall-to-wall tents, where infections travel, well, like our wildfires. But no photos can really show the kids' blank stares, wide open eyes on red alert for what bad's going to happen next. So this room really looked pretty light, but it was mostly my flash. Migrants live in the dark. Strapped shelters can't afford much electricity. Ironically, it's the exact opposite in detention centers in the US, where we hold migrants. Their lights are on all night, checks every 15 minutes, sleeps on an ice-cold concrete floor with only aluminum shields for warmth. We pediatricians have gone down and documented the terrible mental health impact of this sleep deprivation in kids. Every medical society I know of, American Society for Family Practice, American College of Physicians, American Psychiatry Association, etc., have all called out such practices as torture. Sigh break. So imagine living in this room, about the size of my basement, with 300 other people, 3 bathrooms. Guess how often your toilets would overflow. And there's constant noise, constant. I was ready to go crazy after about 8 hours, and how migrants don't is a real mystery. But alas, many do, and flee to any place in the open air, like this, another sewage ditch. Since no buses, of course, go out to such places, our Refugee Health Alliance goes out there. Now, Tijuana keeps no records on homelessness, so it's pretty hard to tell how much worse homelessness is in there compared to San Diego or Portland. But Portland doesn't have to handle the 67,000 deportees and asylees who arrived in Tijuana in 2019 alone. That's only one border town. Mr. Trump's energetic attempts to make the asylee process so cruel has actually not discouraged asylees from coming. The number of asylees in Tijuana are still increasing. Even those presently sheltered, though, are always at risk of homelessness. Their shelters lose funding. One day, Tijuana's mayor just up and closed a number of shelters. Now, half our patients, including this fellow, had wound issues. A scratch when you live on the streets rapidly gets infected. Many wounds were in the drug addicted. Am I losing your sympathy? But wait, why do Mexican drug cartels love our president? Because his policies dump 200 depressed, despairing deportees each day into Tijuana and more into other towns. This despair leads to a huge future consumer base for drug cartels, meth and heroin. So I want you to close your eyes a minute, really close them, and imagine yourself. You're left at the border 48 hours after being suddenly arrested. You have no housing. You're in a country and a language not yours. No social support. You bump constantly into San Diego men crossing the border for low-cost sex. You've had your papers confiscated, preventing both health, insurance, and work. And the drop-off place is a slum, highly saturated with drug cartels and pushers. How long do you think your despair might lead you to a drink? Well, some say these deportees, since they're all criminals, deserve to be sent out of our country. Well, let's look at the facts which debunk that myth that we deport only criminals or addicts. 2/3 of deportees were never convicted of a crime. And most of those who had a crime were just one DUI, driving under the influence. Not that I think that's a very good thing to do, but that was their big crime. For those 40% who had ever had a drug crime, quote, what was their crime? Most of them was marijuana possession, now legal in 33 states. So you can see how these things are used as excuses to deport. Now, for those few who had real drug issues, what we do to them creates the perfect setup for recidivism. Research shows over and over that the main factors in starting drugs or for past users to repeat and reuse eliminate housing, support systems, income, and health care. The recipe is exactly the same for getting AIDS or TB or other common diagnoses there. So this is what's happening to our neighbors deported to below the border. Let's go back to what happens to an asylee like Jesus or any asylum seeker as he begins his credible fear interview. This credible fear interview would get him a refugee designation. In 2016, 85,000 asylees passed this interview. Last year, less than 15,000. This year, even before COVID changed things, less than 100. That's because of those 4 executive orders that I talked about. There are a lot more than these 4, but these are the 4 biggies. So with this metering, Jesus would have to wait at least 3 months to even get a number to apply, to wait in this line. If he does get through, his chance, 0.1% of ever crossing the border. If his number is called to enter the customs center, he will be treated like a prison. All his possessions will be taken. I constantly had to give out medicines to patients who had them prior to crossing for their interview. A Guatemalan with a severe infection whose antibiotics were confiscated. I had to send 2 asthmatic kids to hospital after their inhalers were confiscated. A mother fleeing police rape in Honduras had her seizure meds taken. Your guess is as good as mine whether border police agents are mean just because they can be, or are they getting directions from above to punish those who seek our shores? This is actually art. It's from an art exhibit of Tom Kiefer. Tom had worked for years as a janitor at Arizona's border facility, taking out trash bin after bin of belongings confiscated by border police, who described all of these as potentially lethal or non-essential. Now, we all know how lethal that Alka-Seltzer is and how non-essential that insulin. You can't see it, but I assure you it's there. Foods also confiscated, so malnutrition worsens, and it was really hard for me to diagnose cancer when a cardinal sign of cancer is weight loss. But so many of my patients had that. And just to be extra mean, their confiscated food, which was previously donated to a food bank, is now just thrown away with their Bibles, rosary, and toothpaste. But do not despair. There are heroes. This is Siley. Let me get that out of the way here. You might want to get that out of the way because this guy in the upper right is my hero. Or down, maybe that works. Yeah. Anyways, he had run a restaurant in Honduras. So in his year wait to get a number, to get his credible fear interview, he started a restaurant in Tijuana to great success. He then gifted his fellow asylees with a weekly free meal. Just a minute. Oh. For many of these asylees, it was the only healthy meal they got. So why do we need all these heroes? Let's take another side break. So while we were at the border in December, our RHA board member, Dr. Hannah, was working with Doctors for Camp Closure, which I'll tell you about later. And so they brought hundreds of flu vaccines and doctors to give them to San Diego's Border Detention Center, making international news when Border Patrol turned them away. Instead, we held a candlelight vigil. So yes, Refugee Health Alliance serves both those in Mexico as well as immigrants detained in the U.S., whose numbers are rapidly rising since January of 2017, when U.S. policy greatly increased the imprisonment of detained immigrants. The Trump administration added $2.7 billion a year to your taxes to hold 300,000 more immigrants in privately run prisons, for-profit prisons. My cynical father always said, follow the money. So at a charge of $150 a day per immigrant, these new policies are very lucrative to the private prison industry. The profits of the largest one, GEO, rose 30% to $5 billion in 1 year alone. Now, Obama's immigration policies weren't great. We'll get into those later. But because he allowed most immigrants to wait in their communities while their asylum cases were pending, he had far fewer detentions in prison. Now, with so many more detainees, our immigrant courts have a backlog of about 1 million, at least, cases, and the average time spent in these detention centers like Tacoma or in regular criminal prisons like Norcor, over a year. That's $54,000 per immigrant per year. Our taxpayers' loss, GEO's company gain. Well, does anything work to mitigate these policies? Have any of you heard of a Sheridan prison story? If so, unmute yourself. Not hearing any. Well, in summer of 2018, 120 asylee seekers, among the few who actually passed their credible fear interviews, 120 were not allowed anymore to live in their communities while awaiting their asylum cases. They were sent from the Mexican border to the federal prison in Sheridan, Oregon. Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Guesses where the majority were from? Any guesses? Unmute yourself. Well, it was not the Mexico our president vilifies, but mostly Southeast Asian and Sikhs. Now, Interfaith Movement for Immigrant Justice, Emerge, we call ourselves, is the old sanctuary movement of the 80s. The members today are not churches only, but they're Buddhists, Jews, Christians, Sikhs, Unitarians, Muslims, and hundreds of non-religiously affiliated. So it really is faith in mankind rather than in a religion. So Emerge arranged regular protests at Sheridan's prison. And the Oregon Sikh community, because so many of their members were involved, rallied around us. They served us fabulous Indian food and played Sikh music for our protests. Kind of made suffering less sufferable. We also worked with Portland-based Innovation Law Lab to mount a first-of-its-kind lawsuit for all 120 men, rather than trying to talk 120 individual pro bono, that is, free lawyers, one for each prisoner, particularly since the prisons were denying most lawyers access. The innovative suit won. Eventually, all 120 were released into the community to await their asylum cases. These two outfits, by the way, Emerge and Innovation Law Labs, are two of my favorites, and we'll get back to some of those later. Another success story, but it took 3 years rather than 3 months. Norcor Prison in the Dalles had contracted with ICE to imprison immigrants who'd committed no crime. They were there for months to years with no family visiting, extremely limited phone calls, and no access to lawyers. Norcor did allow clergy visits, though, and the clergy, bless them, seeing the awful plight of imprisoned immigrants, formed the Gorge Resistance. We in Portland are probably pretty tired of protest, but prior to May, peaceful protests could accomplish something. Gorge Resistance, which was composed of churches, temples, and once again a lot of non-affiliated folks, stood outside Norcor Prison every day for 3 years, every day. When COVID started, we Emerge physicians tried to get safety measures implemented at Norcor. Unfortunately, with no more success than at most other prisons where there have been 114,000 documented COVID cases. The COVID numbers in prison are certainly higher, but we don't have access to a lot of testing there. In one center in Virginia, where they did test everyone, 97% were COVID positive. You could say that prison is our new form of execution. More prisoners have died from COVID than have been executed in the last 20 years. Anyway, last month, here's our success. Norcor's board terminated their contract with ICE. No more prison time there for Oregon immigrants. Yes, it took 3 years, but change rarely comes quickly. BLM, Black Lives Matter protesters, face that fact as they try to figure out to stop or not to stop. So we're going to take a side break and then a real break. Let's take, who wants to suggest a number of minutes? Kathy or someone in charge? 10 minutes? 5 minutes?
Sounds good. 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay.
It'll take 10 by the time we start again. So.
Okay.
Jenny, try the little buttons in the left-hand corner of your screen. The third button, the rightmost button down at the bottom, should start you up again.
Oh, okay, there we go. Okay. All right, so where were we? So this is 28. So we had just come off a successful Norcor. One of the questions during break was, what can we do? And so join Gorge Resistance and get those immigrants out of criminal prisons. So that brings up a important thing. Why did I, as a physician, get out of my exam room and start doing this? And I think it was because as a physician, I work with non-medical groups, particularly here in the U.S., because otherwise it's so much putting on Band-Aids for all the social determinants of health. Those COVID numbers that you saw, the infections and the deaths, show why it's really true. I can't cure those COVID deaths in prison. I just have to get them out. So today, a lot of health organizations, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Doctors for Camp Closure, Physicians for Human Rights, are partnering with human rights lawyers to get nonviolent detainees and prisoners out of prison, which are basically COVID incubators. And you may have heard how awful they are during the wildfires when all the prisons were smooshed together. So anyways, Refugee Health Alliance, knowing that crowded camps were disease incubators, did partner with lawyers. And with the basic shutdown of asylum in just one border town, Tijuana, when I was there, there were 15,000 asylees stuck in camps waiting. There were a total of 8 asylum lawyers in Tijuana. Asylum law is very different than regular law. You don't want just a regular lawyer to handle your case. And so RHA partnered with Al Otro Lado, which means to the other side, which was 4 local lawyers, and then they recruited some U.S. volunteer lawyers. And so now it's time for some more hero stories. Get my thing working here. This is Nicole. She's an attorney. She flies down monthly for a weekend from Missouri. She's an NGO lawyer herself, which means she doesn't make a lot of bucks, so she can't afford her monthly airfare. So she got her well-off fellow friend lawyers to donate their air miles. Now Nicole knows that with backlogged immigration courts, families, many fleeing that horrific violence I talked about, wait in these shelters 3 years. Nicole's sainthood comes from knowing and keeping plugging on, even though she knows her success rate is 0.1%. As a physician, I couldn't work with those odds myself. But for Nicole, each success is worth it. The asylum petition of her client, Honduran political activist Axel, was denied by his immigration judge, who ruled that Axel's claim of being shot at by the Honduran government did fit the credible fear criterion, but it didn't warrant asylum because the bullets never actually hit him. So Axel spent 9 months in detention in the U.S. But Nicole and Al Otro Lado got him free. So 0.1%, but worth it. Al Otro also helps deportees in Tijuana. As I talked earlier, before I worked there, I, and maybe you too, thought far more of the upstream effect of our policies. A member of my church, a nurse with a green card, was incarcerated in Tacoma, was arrested and then incarcerated in Tacoma. He lost his salary, of course. His partner became homeless, another homeless person in Portland. I was pretty focused on detainee families, therefore, and my focus was also coming from my work of being an ACL legal observer, sent to courthouses to record instances of immigrant injustice. Because ICE was arresting immigrants and those who they thought might be immigrants because they had dark skin, they looked like immigrants, they must be, right? They were arresting people in and around our courthouses. Paper break here. So I took this photo of an immigrant arrested in a courtroom without a judicial warrant, not read his Miranda rights, nor spoken to in a language he understood. With such photos, witnessing intense lobbying by ACLU and my Emerge group, we petitioned all last summer, and Oregon's Chief Justice finally agreed. The fear of arrest caused by ICE present, made all immigrants, legal or not, papers or not, they avoided our courthouses as complainants, as witnesses, to get married. Justice for all was not being served. So Chief Justice banned ICE in and around our courts. Another success, George. All right. So it was only in Tijuana that I see what happened after ICE deported fellows like this. Knowing that Border Patrol so frequently stripped folks of their vital ID, our clinic, Privin Casa, set up one of the few clinics not requiring ID. So we were inundated with deportees. These men and women didn't want to live on the streets, so our patients couldn't, but they couldn't work without an ID. So we got Al Otro to advocate not only for these deported, not only for the deported, but to get their ID back so they could work. Al Otro also advocates for those deported illegally. I know none of you think that ICE ever makes a mistake. So there were a lot of successes as we worked as medical people with a law group. Those successes, however, were obviously hated by this administration. Last year, the two American directors of Al Otro Lado were themselves held at the border when trying to return to their San Diego homes. The directors now fear going back to Tijuana. They might not get readmitted. Complaints to Homeland Security about such persecution have gone, surprise, unanswered. Okay, gang, side break. So, what we heard of Tijuanans, people in Tijuana. Let's see, we've frozen here again. So we heard of Tijuanans who hated migrants, and it would certainly be understandable when 60,000 mostly destitute immigrants are dropped on their doorstep every year. But we only saw great empathy and gratitude for those who came down to help. Now, many outfits who were serving the thousands down there were secular. Many were religious. Now, admittedly, religion does some not compassionate stuff in the world, but many of Tijuana's religious folk are helping. This tent camp, seen through the door of this church, you can see, go through the far door, that's where that tent camp was. The church had recently taken all the pews out of their sanctuary so that they could house more migrants, as well as our clinic. The day we were there, we saw pretty much every one of the 300 people in that tent camp. I would say about half we saw for depression, quite understandable. The other half for diseases of crowding. We saw how vaccines are excluded from border care, and it's no surprise that this shelter had a chickenpox epidemic, as did many other border centers. Shelters have other issues. Women's safety. Many of these women and children have no male protectors. Religious observance is an issue. To us, that may seem more of an option, but for immigrants, what helps them get through their tragedies. Muslims can't pray, prompting San Diego Muslims to start a shelter. The Jewish Community Center and their services set up a kosher one. Now, my bad Spanish was even more useless for the thousands of French speakers fleeing civil war in Cameroon or Haiti's constant disasters. This photo is actually not mine. We participated and were trained in something called trauma-informed care. We have to be sure that docs, nurses don't repeat patients' trauma during our care. So it's very rarely do we take photos, both for the dignity and the safety of migrants, who are often tracked by gangs or their government. This photo is actually from an article on Haitians who post-2010 hurricane fled to welcoming Brazil. But 5 years later, Brazil's economy tanked. Migrants there, as in the US, became scapegoats, hated drags on the market. So this mom was forced out of Brazil, again traversing back through 60 miles of jungle on foot, again paying her savings to smugglers. The resilience of migrants was an amazing lesson to me. A wimpy American who wants my car, my air trips, and my chocolate. But she was just still so inspiring. But unfortunately, she got to Tijuana just as we stopped closing our border. So she was still in shelter in Little Haiti, a slum where many Haitians were stuck following Obama's awful, vigorous deportation policies. And that's where I saw her, in Little Haiti. Yes, our black president's policies sent many Haitians to such camps. Obama actually has the one-year record, deporting 430,000 in 2012. So what are the big bad changes? Well, in those days we deported pretty much only criminals, but that's no longer our practice, although it is our rhetoric. Anyone is deportable now. The second big change was what I talked about before. Immigrants are in prison rather than released to the community while awaiting court decisions. Anyway, this gal is such a lesson on hope. The day I saw her, her lottery number for her asylum, 4,300. But she daily walks the 4 miles to the center. Yesterday she told me her number was 3,000. So there are many days when no interviews are given, but her chances are slim and she knows it. Still, she goes every day. Okay, another side break here. So I'm going to talk about Sundays there to show you the ecumenical nature of the work done. Even my secular, agnostic Jewish hubby experienced some of the holy nature of services there, the first time ever for him. On Sundays, you may say that I got really holy. I got communion twice. First, my landlord took me to this used to be gray Catholic church. The growing Pentecostal movement there bought it and wanted it to be a more welcoming pink. And it certainly was a lot more friendly, with some really fun music, which I hope to play for you. Now that communion cup in the center there, it's traditionally a Christian cup, but it was later served at this ecumenical service by Muslims in Hajib. Muslims also did their prayer service there, which I may or may not be able to get you to hear. Well, you're really fortunate. My computer video skills are so bad that you don't have to listen to the 10-minute prayer in Arabic. But the vigil is a 1-hour service a week. And during that time, the Border Patrol opens the U.S. side of the wall so that families, for a measly 60 minutes, can see their loved ones through the bars. The family there at the far center in the middle had been coming 12 years to touch their beloveds through the bars. The service is also the go-to place for NGO workers. I met those shelter builders there. There were many environmental groups there who were just all really depressed because in December there had been a recent Supreme Court ruling against environmental challenges to the wall, which I talked about earlier. Since then, you may have read about the terrible environmental consequences of that collapsing wall on the Rio Grande River. That was a segment that was built with private funds raised by the president's friends, 4 of whom have recently been indicted for scamming their donors of millions. Also met Hector there. Hector is running one of 2 deported veteran support groups, serving some of the more than 3,000 deported vets in Tijuana alone. Hector was an Afghanistan Marine for 6 years under promise of full citizenship. Did he get permanent resident status? Yes, he got permanent resident status. Who thinks permanent resident status is permanent? Raise your hand. No, it's not. It's not permanent. He was deported by the country he risked his life for. He's given up trying to go back to the U.S. to see his kids. He feels his vets need his wisdom developed over the last 10 years. He's been stuck there. Hector worked with us to get Pedro, one of those vets, who was dying. Pedro was staying in this shelter above a cafe, which is another ministry of that wonderful group of people, the Border Angels. So we were trying to get Pedro to rent an apartment closer to clinic for ease of care as he died. Pedro turned us down. He didn't want to die alone, and he wanted to be amongst people who spoke his language, English. If you buy at this cafe, all the money is donated to shelter vets. My husband is, Dr. George, is working with Hector to try to sign some forms for vets because U.S. immigration judges won't accept forms signed by Mexican docs, which is catch-22 because deported vets can't cross the border to go get their entitled VA care. A mess. So this is the second vet support group in Tijuana. They're called Discharged and then Discarded. Pretty much of a shame on us. Well, who would have thought, let's scratch these for a little bit, who would have thought that my English major skills would be a lot more helpful than at times my medical skills were. One of our doctor's tasks was to write letters. Some were for kids whose medical problems would make separation life-threatening. Yes, separations are still happening. We know of at least 1,100 children separated since the court ban on family separation. These kids are often sent thousands of miles away from their parents and with no way to track them. The 1,100 figure is likely much higher according to DHS Inspector General. DHS is Department of Homeland Security. The Inspector General found that the tracking system for children is so flawed that there is no way to know the real number nor what become of the kids. The head of my American Academy of Pediatrics calls this policy government-sanctioned child abuse. Physicians for Human Rights went down there, and they work all over the world, but they went down to Tijuana border, and they documented the frequent practice of border agents physically ripping children, babies as young as 4 months from parents' arms, disappearing children while their parents were in different holding cells, removing parents while children slept. Physicians for Human Rights has termed this torture. Any of you remember what other practice was termed torture? Well, it was the Border Patrol agents, how they treated the kids in our detention centers in the U.S. Anyways, back to those letters that I wrote. One was for a 4-year-old kid who had severe lung disease. She required a nebulizer and a feeding tube. Sounds crazy. Why do I have to write a letter to keep this kid with her caretaker? Other letters try to prevent those meds from being confiscated. We also wrote asylum letters that trying to get that pregnant woman made pregnant through rape by police in Honduras. I'm sorry, who's getting tired of Ginny always talking about problems that can't be fixed? I'm getting tired. So let's go to some more heroes, and let's take another side break.
Jenny?
Yeah.
I don't want to breathe too deep. The air's too bad.
I'm sorry, what?
The air's so bad, I hate to take a deep breath.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh. What to do? I think that might be a metaphor, whoever said that, for our life these days, what to do. Well, anyways, Our Prevent Casa clinic didn't really see themselves as a fixer. It called itself a harms reduction clinic. It wisely didn't try to fix everything. It provided needle exchange, mental health and nutrition counseling, methadone treatment, as well as our medical care. Fortunately, other groups do, let's see if we can actually go back to this, like the Border Angels do take care of things like housing. Now, the cheapest food in Tijuana is high carb, and most asylees and deportees are indigenous folks with those diabetes genes. So diabetes was very common, as was high blood pressure, hard to control with all the stress. One unexpected gift, I loved it, was a visit by the Acupuncturists Without Borders. And they came down for a whole week and worked their magic on our stressed deportees. What I felt I needed was Clowns Without Borders. Believe it or not, there is a Clowns Without Borders, and I sure needed them most days. Now, most deportees have lived, I'm going to stop screen sharing for a while. Okay. Most deportees have lived 20 plus years in the US. We're not talking about recent people they're deporting. They've been successful, all of them paying taxes, raising kids now. Well, one burly 200-pounder, an ex-construction worker from Phoenix, teared up as he started talking about his family in the US. He still hadn't recovered his confiscated ID, so he couldn't. Tijuana hasn't an inch of green space, and walking on streets is really dangerous. So no exercise. He gained 30 pounds, developed diabetes and high blood pressure, and both were totally out of control as he rationed his meds until the clinic got some more. Jason, who's my schizophrenic patient, approved our landlord Raul's black humor on how Mexico's economy rises or falls with the U.S. Raul said, if the U.S. gets a cold, we get pneumonia. And Jason proved that. He was brought in by his caretaker mom after he had a psychotic break. With the U.S. housing crisis, San Diego being one of the worst, his mom had moved across to Tijuana's cheaper housing, but Jason lost his medicines. I struggled for days. What meds was he on? Where could I get them in Mexico? But before I could do either, his agitation off meds increased and he got arrested, and we never saw him again. So if the U.S. has a housing crisis, Tijuana gets worse. If the U.S. gets a cold, Tijuana gets pneumonia. Raul was also the source of a more fun Tijuana adage, at least more fun for those of certain political persuasions. He said, we Mexicans are not willing to pay for the wall. We are willing to pay for impeachment. Well, let's have a little Tijuana travelogue now. Both U.S. and immigration, both the U.S. trade and immigration policies have devastated Tijuana. Except for the tourist area downtown, Tijuana spends nothing on infrastructure. Its few extra pesos goes for those 60,000 extra poor immigrants stuck there. Clean water is diverted to the tourist area. Our clinic often functioned without water. Few streets were negotiable. Like in many South border towns, multinationals built innumerable factories, attracting rural farmers made destitute by our NAFTA policies. Around Tijuana, 100,000 poorly paid factory workers built their own houses on those cheap hills whose natural drainage was eliminated by the wall. Let's see, am I going to share? We had to close the clinic early on rainy days. This sewer draining outside the clinic, this was 4 days after the rain. And when we closed the clinic, we were just inundated with this fetid water. And once again, I wish I could show you the smell-o-vision. But this sewage flows downhill into the Tijuana River and then into the ocean. This is an addition to the contaminated water that flows from all our farm use. All the farm chemicals go into the Tijuana River, which is shared between Tijuana and the U.S., and Tijuana River empties into the ocean. Now, the U.S. has many treaties requiring us to decontaminate this water before it gets to the Tijuana River and into the ocean, but with cuts to the EPA, guess what's not happening now? So we treated very frequently workers who had awful rashes by going into this water or into the river. Rashes, respiratory symptoms from those polluted waters. But the wall can't prevent that water, contaminated water, from flowing the other way around the wall, so that it flows into the U.S. next door to San Diego, whose beaches are closed 3/4 of the year. Mexico's righteous, stinky revenge for our trade and immigration policies. But the U.S. is so far ahead on tit for tat. Our drug consumption and our war on drug drive the cartels who make Tijuana the murder capital of the world. Sigh break. But don't despair, because I've got more saints to show you. Working months to years without pay is Nurse Mary there on the left. Dr. Chris was particularly amazing because he was a Canadian. He volunteered even without our American guilt for causing this mess. Pre-med student Kate, running the clinic, helping us find the so limited referrals, explaining clinic policy to each and every new volunteer, such as our first question, which had to be, what is your gender? He, she, they? This was really important because transgenders were persecuted all over Central America, and they were very prominent in the caravans, hence in the shelters and in our clinic. Now, the clinic's possible because of someone I call Saint Rebecca. She started the clinic after our U.S. deportees inundated Tijuana. Rebecca, like all saints, does not play by the rules. She goes around every boundary to get care for her patients. You would not believe how she wangled expensive AIDS drugs, got hormone treatments to be one of Tijuana's rare, safe transgender programs. Now, you may ask about that, but the transgenders are really very common there, and 1 in 4 transgenders in Tijuana are HIV positive. 1 in 4. And this mostly due to the past unsafe black market injections that they received, the hormone injections. And then Rebecca also breaks the rule that one person shouldn't be lovely in face, lovely in soul, and a fine doctor, which she was. She had such a heart for the unloved, the mentally ill, the homeless, addicts, prostituted women. So as long as we're on R-rated subjects, the sexual violence of our wars that we supported in Nicaragua and El Salvador, in those, rape was used as a weapon. It was taught to soldiers. That culture continued. Thousands of shamed, often impregnated women migrated through Mexico on hopeful journeys to the U.S. So when you think of who are these migrants coming up, they're not all looking for TV sets. But these women, often alone with their kids, they're all highly vulnerable to trafficking. You might pay a smuggler to get you into the U.S., but end up as a sex or labor slave. Kidnappings from the shelters for trafficking made the pastors of that large church I showed you, they debated, should we lock our doors for protection, but turn our church into a prison? So Mexico is one of the country that sets up zones for legal prostitution, and our clinic was right in the middle of such a zone. So sex tourism was all around us. I worked for years with a Portland lawyer and an NGO in India to prevent the entry into sex work. In India, we found that unaccompanied women and girl kids, particularly those separated from their families, were really high risk for being captured into forced prostitution. In Mexico, there are 20,000 known prostituted children. The profitability of Tijuana's sex tourism makes Tijuana number 2 in the world for this child prostitution. So I was so delighted. Why is this working? To find Father Sergio, who's Santa Teresa Fundación, to prevent this entry into prostitution. But more bad about kids. Many of you may be aware of Palestinian child arrest by Israeli soldiers. 400 kids held in adult military prisons just in the first 2 months of 2019. Hey, Dr. Ginny, this is way off immigration, right? But Israel trained our ICE and Border Patrol agents. And so we saw lots and lots of kid arrests. Under U.S. pressure, Mexico's president's orders have caused the detention of 40,000 underage migrants. What awaits a kid who does get into the U.S.? More separation, as we talked about before. One part of Emerge, that interfaith movement I talked about before, as part of them, I advocate to ICE to try to get detained kids reunited with their parents. One of my few successes, maybe partial. Anyways, there were 2 teens, aged 13 and 15 at the time of separation. Each were held in the Cowlitz County Juvenile Jail for the last 2 years, thousands of miles from their parents on the East Coast. We got both of them finally released, well, to foster care, not to their own parents, but at least they're out of jail. Okay, your last side break, we're almost made it. So there have been 3 recent rulings affecting kids. The first particularly, I think, betrays children. I'll tell you the story of 15-year-old Uceda, who fled Honduras after being forced into gang participation. You heard Marilyn say, I worked in Central America as a doc, and I know how gangs work. I talked in confidence with innumerable teens there who were not looking for asylum. They were just talking. The gang made me join. They threatened that if I didn't, my family would be killed. What would you do? These threats pushed Uceda into participating in gang drug dealings and be present at the beating up of his cousin. When the gang killed the cousin for not joining the gang, Uceda took his sister and fled to the U.S. by himself. Now, the U.S. Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, requires such minors to have mental health treatment. Pretty good idea. The boy's psychologist got his trust, assuring him confidentiality. The boy told her all. We professionals know HIPAA law applies. We cannot reveal patient information without their permission. But our president, newly appointed ORR head, made an egregious agreement with ICE that therapy records would be open to ICE eyes without patient's permission. This breaking of trust was protested by every medical and psychological organization in the U.S. And Uceda had been granted asylum by the judge here before. ICE got the records and had the judgment reversed. So for the last 2 years, Uceda's been incarcerated as a gang member, while ICE tries to deport him back, and his lawyer argue he's a victim of the violent mess the U.S. helped create in Central America. You and your family threatened? Does such a lose-lose have a right answer, even for us mature adults? And it's well documented, such kids sent back to Central America disappear or are found murdered. So ICE uses his therapy to get him back to death. Now, if you can stomach this sort of thing, view the documentary, Paper Children. It's free on YouTube. I only got through a few minutes, but for some, it's more believable if you see it. 2 other recent rules impacted, I don't know why this is not working, have been impacting kids. We talked about the psychotherapy records, but asylees and refugees in the U.S. cannot work now for 1 year, so it was almost tripled by Trump's ruling, while awaiting their cases. This guarantees parents and kids will either live in poverty or have to accept food stamps, WIC, or Medicaid. But catch-22, the public charge rule. The Supreme Court recently overruled a lower court and held the president's expansion of the public charge ruling. Immigrants are now not allowed to work, but they will be denied legal status or green cards if they use pretty much any public service, from WIC to Medicaid, or if they are judged likely to use such services. The lower court had ruled against this expansion because it discriminated against families and against poor immigrants of color. So, what to do? George asked me this question. Was there merit in our going? We did touch the miserable, and on some days healed some. Up until COVID, I'd urged everyone, lawyers, environmentalists, judges, translators, health workers, builders, go there, the need's immense. But even before COVID, when I asked the question of our vet friend Hector, I said, Hector, what can my community do? His simple answer, you've got to elect a government that sees the immorality of all this. So in closing, let's not forget that prophet Jeremiah, how he finished his story on Rachel's weeping. Quote, keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears. Your reward for work will come. So the answer to depression and weeping, get to work. Health folks returning from the border, their work there, formed the national organization I talked about before, Physicians and Doctors for Camp Closure. Here they were trying to get flu vaccines into camps. Of course, post-COVID, all of us are wearing masks. Today, what we're trying to do is get into the prisons and detention centers hand sanitizer stations, physical distancing between prisoners. So there's lots and lots and lots to do, and I can refer you to innumerable organizations where outraged citizens can work to change these facts. The list of organizations is fortunately very long. So those are my stories, my thoughts about what success is, and I'd love to hear your stories and what you'd like to see, your questions. So let's open it up, and can we unmute all those people who